Welcome to The Night Story, where real scary experiences are told in the quiet. Tonight's story comes from a place where the forest is older than the roads, and where people have whispered about a woman in the trees for years. Some say she's just a stranger living deep in the woods. Others say something far darker walks there after sunset. Make sure to like the video and subscribe to The Night Story if you enjoy real scary stories like this. It helps the channel grow, and please comment where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Before I start, there's something important I should explain. My grandmother isn't alive anymore. She passed away a few years ago, peacefully, after spending the last part of her life living with my parents. By that time, she was already too old to live alone, so we moved her out of the house in the forest and into our home where we could take care of her. And I'm glad we did, because after everything that happened that summer, I never liked the idea of her staying in that house by herself, so at least I know she spent her final years somewhere safe. But the story I'm about to tell happened long before that, back when she was still living alone in the forest, and back when I was 19. Sometimes I still think about that place, about the quiet, about the trees, and about the woman who used to stand between them, because even now, I still don't know who she was or why she kept coming closer to the house. But I do know one thing: she wasn't lost. She knew exactly where the house was, and she kept coming back. This happened about 8 years ago, during the summer after my first year of college. At the time, I was 19 years old and had no real plans for the summer break. The bookstore where I worked during the school year had closed for renovations, which meant I suddenly had almost 3 months with nothing scheduled. My parents suggested I look for another job, but my grandmother called one afternoon with a different idea. She asked if I wanted to stay with her for a while. She lived alone in a small wooden house deep in the forests of northern Oregon. The property had belonged to my grandfather years before he passed away, and after that, she simply stayed there. The house sat at the end of a long gravel road that wound through miles of pine forest. If you drove from the nearest town, it took about 20 minutes just to reach the road that led toward her property. Then, another 10 minutes down the narrow gravel path itself. Halfway down that road, your phone lost signal. By the time you reached the house, there was nothing connecting you to the outside world anymore. No cell service, no traffic, no streetlights, just trees. Endless rows of tall pine trees stretching in every direction. At the time, I thought it sounded peaceful, a quiet place to spend part of the summer, somewhere away from the noise of the city. And for the first few days, that's exactly what it felt like: peaceful. But there was something about that forest I didn't understand yet, something the people who lived nearby seemed to know instinctively. Something my grandmother tried to warn me about on the very first night I stayed there. She didn't say much, just one strange rule, and at the time, I didn't take it seriously. But looking back now, I really wish I had, because the longer I stayed in that house, the more I started noticing someone standing in the trees behind it, always at the edge of the forest, always completely still, watching. And the worst part is, she was getting closer every night. The first few days I stayed with my grandmother felt completely normal, peaceful even. Her house sat on a small clearing, surrounded by forest on almost every side. From the front porch, you could see the gravel driveway stretching about 40 yards toward the road, but beyond that, the trees took over again. Tall pines packed so closely together that sunlight barely reached the ground in some areas. Behind the house, the forest started almost immediately. There was a small backyard, just a patch of uneven grass and a few old garden beds my grandmother didn't use anymore. But once you walked 20 or 30 feet past that yard, the ground changed from grass to pine needles and roots, and after that, it was just forest. The house itself was simple: 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a narrow kitchen that always smelled faintly like coffee, and a living room with 2 large windows that faced directly toward the backyard and the trees. Those windows became important later, but during the first few days, they were just part of the view. My grandmother had lived there for nearly 30 years, so the place was full of small routines and habits she had developed over time. She woke up early every morning, usually around 6. I would wake up later and find her already sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the small radio she used to listen to local news. There wasn't much happening in that area, so most of the news was about weather or farming reports. After breakfast, she would usually go outside and sit on the front porch for a while. Sometimes she read books. Sometimes she just watched the forest. I remember asking her once if she ever got bored living out there. She laughed when I said that. Then she said something I didn't understand at the time. "Out here you start noticing things other people miss." I assumed she meant nature, birds, animals, changes in the seasons. But later I wondered if she meant something else entirely. Most afternoons, I spent exploring the trails behind the house. Years ago, logging companies had cut several dirt paths through the forest, and even though the logging stopped long before I was born, many of those trails were still there. Some were wide enough to walk easily. Others had almost disappeared under plants and fallen branches. But they all led deeper into the woods. The forest itself was beautiful during the day. Sunlight filtered through the tall pine branches in thin golden beams. The ground smelled like damp earth and pine needles. Sometimes I would see deer moving quietly between the trees. Once or twice I even spotted foxes in the distance. Nothing about the place felt threatening, just quiet, almost calming. But the evenings were different. Every day around sunset, the forest seemed to change. The light faded quickly between the trees, turning everything darker much faster than in open areas. Bird sounds slowly disappeared. Insects became louder, and the shadows between the trees grew deeper until the forest looked like a solid wall of darkness. That was when my grandmother's routine always changed. No matter what she was doing, she would stop as soon as the sun dropped low enough behind the trees. Then she would start preparing the house for the night. First, she closed the windows. Then she pulled the curtains over the large living room windows facing the backyard. After that, she checked the locks, front door, back door, sometimes even the small latch on the kitchen window. She did it the exact same way every evening, slowly, carefully, like it was something she had done thousands of times before. The first couple of nights I didn't think much about it. Living in a remote place probably makes people cautious. But after a few days, I started noticing something strange about the forest once the sun went down. It wasn't just dark, it was quiet. And I don't mean the normal quiet of nighttime. Sometimes it felt like the entire forest had gone still. No insects, no animals, no wind, just complete silence. The kind of silence that makes you suddenly aware of every small sound inside the house. The creak of the wooden floor, the hum of the refrigerator, even the soft ticking of the clock in the living room. One night I stepped out, onto the back porch after dinner, just to look at the stars. Out there, with no city lights nearby, the sky was incredibly clear. But I remember something about that moment feeling strange. I was standing on the porch, looking up at the sky, when I suddenly realized something. The forest behind the house was completely silent. Not one sound, no crickets, no wind, nothing. Just darkness between the trees. I stood there for a minute, listening, and that's when my grandmother opened the back door behind me. She didn't sound angry, but she did sound serious. "Don't stay outside after dark," she said quietly. I turned around and asked why. She hesitated for a moment before answering. Then she simply said, "It's better if you come inside once the sun is down." The way she said it made it sound less like advice and more like a rule. At the time, I thought she was just being protective. After all, the forest could be dangerous at night. There were animals out there, coyotes, maybe even bears. But as the days went on, I started noticing something else. Sometimes, when I walked the trails during the late afternoon, I had the strange feeling that someone else was in the forest with me. Not walking, not making noise, just there, somewhere between the trees, watching. I never saw anyone. And every time I stopped to listen, the forest sounded normal again. Birds moving through branches, leaves shifting in the wind. Nothing unusual, So I told myself it was just my imagination, but a few days later, something happened late at night that made me realize I might not have been alone out there after all. And it started with something walking slowly across the gravel behind the house. A few days after I arrived, my grandmother finally explained the rule more clearly. It happened during dinner. We were sitting at the small kitchen table like we did most evenings. The window above the sink faced the side of the house, and through it, you could see the edge of the forest beginning only a few steps away. The sun was already dropping behind the trees, and the kitchen was slowly filling with that dim orange light that comes right before sunset. My grandmother was quiet that evening, not nervous exactly, just thoughtful. After we finished eating, she stood up like she always did and walked to the back door. She locked it. Then she pulled the curtain across the window beside it. I remember watching her do it and finally asking something that had been on my mind for a few days. "Why do you lock everything so early?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked to the living room and began closing the curtains over the large windows that faced the backyard. When she came back into the kitchen, she sat down again and folded her hands on the table. For a moment, she looked toward the window beside the sink. The forest outside was already starting to disappear into shadow. Then she said something quietly. "People around here have certain habits." I asked what she meant. She shrugged slightly. "Nothing official, just things people learn after living here a long time." I leaned back in the chair. "Like not walking in the woods at night?" She nodded once. "Yes, like that." I asked if it was because of animals, coyotes maybe, or bears. Those seemed like reasonable explanations. But my grandmother shook her head slowly. "There are animals, of course," she said, "but that's not really the reason." That caught my attention. I asked what the reason was. She hesitated for a moment. Then she gave a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Some people say there's a woman who lives somewhere in the forest." I remember laughing a little when she said that. Not because it sounded scary, it just sounded like a local rumor. Every small town has stories like that. Someone living off the grid, a strange neighbor. Something people talk about because there isn't much else to talk about. So I said something like, "You mean a hermit or something?" My grandmother didn't laugh. She just nodded slightly. "Something like that." I asked if anyone knew where she lived. "No." "Has anyone talked to her?" "Not really." That answer surprised me. If people had seen her, I figured someone would have tried to speak to her at some point. But my grandmother explained that most sightings happen from a distance. Someone walking a trail would notice a figure standing between trees, or someone driving down one of the back roads might see someone watching from the forest. Always the same description: a thin woman, long hair, standing very still, watching. I asked if anyone knew her name. My grandmother shook her head. "No one seems to." That part felt strange. In small communities, people usually know each other, even if they live far apart. But apparently, this woman had been seen in the forest for years, without anyone ever figuring out exactly who she was or where she stayed. "Maybe she just lives deeper in the woods," I suggested. My grandmother didn't answer immediately. She just looked toward the window again. By now, the forest outside had turned almost completely dark. Finally, she said something that stuck with me. "She's been seen near houses sometimes." That made me pause. "What do you mean?" "Sometimes people wake up at night and notice someone standing near the edge of the trees." She said it calmly, almost casually, like it wasn't meant to scare me, but it still gave me a strange feeling. "You mean she just stands there?" I asked. My grandmother nodded. "Yes." "And does what?" "Nothing." That answer felt unsettling in a way I couldn't quite explain, because if someone approached a house in the middle of the night, you would expect them to do something. Knock, walk away, move around. But according to what she said, this woman simply stood there, watching. I asked if the police had ever looked for her. Apparently they had. A few times. But the forest in that area was enormous. Miles and miles of trees. Without knowing exactly where someone lived, finding them would be almost impossible. Eventually, the sheriff's department stopped trying. After that, People mostly just ignored the stories, but the local habits remained. Lock the doors before dark, don't walk the forest trails at night. And if you ever see someone standing between the trees, don't approach them. My grandmother didn't say the last part directly, but the way she told the story made the message clear. At the time, I still didn't think much about it. The idea of someone living alone in the woods sounded strange, but not impossible. People do things like that sometimes, especially in rural areas, so I assumed the stories were probably exaggerated, a local mystery people like talking about. But that night, after my grandmother went to bed, something happened outside the house that made those stories feel a lot less like rumors, and a lot more like a warning I should have taken seriously. Because sometime around midnight, I heard footsteps moving slowly across the gravel behind the house, and they stopped right outside the back porch. That first night, I wasn't even planning to stay up late. But when you're in a place that quiet, sleep doesn't always come easily at first. I was sitting in the living room with my laptop around midnight. My grandmother had gone to bed hours earlier, and the rest of the house was completely dark except for the small lamp beside the couch. The living room windows that faced the backyard were covered with curtains now, the same way she closed them every night. Still, you could feel the forest behind them. It's hard to explain that feeling if you've never stayed somewhere truly remote. Even with the curtains closed, you're aware that just a few feet away from the wall, there's nothing but trees and darkness stretching for miles. I had paused the video I was watching and was scrolling through something on my phone when I heard the sound. At first, it was so quiet that I almost ignored it. Just a soft crunch, like gravel, shifting under weight. Then it came again. Crunch. Froze, and looked toward the back of the house. The sound had come from outside, from the direction of the backyard. More specifically, from the gravel path that ran behind the house toward the small shed my grandfather used to keep tools in. I waited. A few seconds passed, then the sound happened again. Crunch, crunch, slow footsteps moving across the gravel. My first thought was that it was a deer. They passed through the yard sometimes, especially late at night. The forest was full of them. But something about the rhythm of the sound felt strange. Animals don't usually walk across gravel slowly. They move quickly, light steps, then they disappear. These steps were different, deliberate, measured, almost cautious. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause. I leaned forward slightly, listening. The footsteps continued for another few seconds. Then they stopped. Right behind the house, not near the shed, not near the trees, right near the back porch. And then nothing. Complete silence. Sat there staring toward the back wall of the house, waiting. The silence stretched longer than I expected. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30. Whoever, or whatever, had walked across the gravel was now standing completely still outside the house. I remember glancing toward the hallway that led to my grandmother's bedroom. The door was closed. She was probably asleep. I considered turning on the porch light, but something about the silence outside made me hesitate. Because if it really was a deer, turning on the light would probably scare it away immediately. But if it wasn't a deer, then what exactly was standing out there? Another 30 seconds passed. Still nothing, no movement, no footsteps, just silence outside the house. Finally, I stood up from the couch, slowly, carefully. The wooden floor creaked under my foot, and the sound felt strangely loud in the quiet room. I walked toward the living room window. The curtain was thick enough that you couldn't see through it from where I stood, but I could reach the edge and pull it aside just enough to look outside. My hand hovered near the curtain. For a moment, I just stood there listening. Still nothing outside. No movement, no breathing, no sound at all. It almost felt like whoever had been walking across the gravel had simply vanished. After another few seconds, I pulled the curtain slightly to the side. The porch light was off, so the yard was dim. Moonlight filtered through the trees, creating faint silver patches across the ground. At first, I didn't see anything. The backyard looked empty. The gravel path was still. The trees beyond the yard stood silent in the darkness. I stared at the tree line for a moment, waiting, half expecting to see something move, but nothing did. Eventually, I let the curtain fall back into place. Maybe it had been a deer after all, or a raccoon, something small passing through the yard. I went back to the couch and sat down again. A few minutes passed, then suddenly, crunch. The sound returned, but this time it was farther away, moving across the gravel again, heading back toward the trees. Crunch, crunch, slow steps, retreating into the forest. Within seconds, the sound disappeared completely, and the forest behind the house returned to silence. The next morning, I mentioned it to my grandmother during breakfast. I didn't expect her to react strongly. I assumed she would say it was probably an animal. But when I told her what I heard, she didn't laugh. She didn't brush it off. Instead, she asked me one simple question. "Did you look outside?" I told her I had, but I didn't see anything. She nodded slowly. Then she asked something else. "Did you go outside?" I shook my head. "No." For a moment, she seemed relieved. Then she said something quietly. "That's good." And that was the end of the conversation. She didn't ask any more questions. She didn't offer any explanations. But the way she said "that's good" stayed in my mind for the rest of the day, because it sounded less like casual conversation and more like confirmation that I had made the right decision. And later that week, when I finally saw someone standing between the trees in the forest, I started realizing exactly why my grandmother had been so careful about the nights out there. After that first night, I tried not to think too much about the footsteps. When you stay somewhere isolated, your mind naturally becomes more alert to small sounds. Every branch snapping or animal moving through leaves can suddenly seem important. So I told myself that's all it was. Probably a deer, maybe a raccoon wandering through the yard. The forest was full of animals. It would have been stranger if nothing ever walked through the property. For the next few days, everything seemed normal again. My grandmother followed the same routine she always had: morning coffee at the kitchen table, listening to the small radio, reading books on the porch during the afternoon. And every evening, just before sunset, she locked the doors and closed the curtains like she always did. The weather was warm that week, so I spent most of my time exploring the trails behind the house. The forest was huge, bigger than I had realized at first. Once you walked more than 10 or 15 minutes from the house, the trails started branching in different directions. Some led downhill toward small creeks. Others curved deeper between the trees. It was easy to lose your sense of direction if you weren't paying attention. Luckily, my grandmother had shown me a few simple landmarks during our walks: a fallen tree shaped like an arch, a large moss-covered rock beside one of the paths, an old rusted sign left from the logging days. As long as I kept those landmarks in mind, I could always find my way back. Most afternoons, I would walk one of the trails for an hour or two before returning to the house. During the day, the forest felt peaceful. Sunlight filtered through the branches in long golden beams. You could hear birds constantly moving through the trees. Sometimes the wind carried the smell of pine and damp soil through the air. It felt like the kind of place where nothing unusual ever happened. But about 3 days after the night I heard the footsteps, I started noticing something strange. I was walking along one of the wider trails about 15 minutes from the house. The path curved gently between the trees, and the ground was covered in dry pine needles. I had been walking for a while when I suddenly had the odd feeling that someone was behind me, not close, but somewhere on the trail. At first, I ignored it. That feeling happens sometimes when you're walking alone. Your mind becomes aware of small sounds and starts imagining things. Still, I slowed down slightly, just to listen. The forest sounded normal, birds calling from somewhere above, leaves shifting lightly in the breeze, nothing unusual. So I kept walking, but after another minute or two, the feeling returned, stronger this time, like someone was standing somewhere behind me on the trail, watching. I stopped walking completely, and the moment I stopped, the forest went quiet, not silent, but noticeably quieter. The birds stopped calling. The wind dropped. For a few seconds, I just stood there, listening. Then I slowly turned around. The trail behind me was empty, just the narrow dirt path winding between tall pine trees. No one standing there, no movement anywhere. I remember staring down the trail for almost 30 seconds, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Eventually, I laughed a little and shook my head. Spending too much time alone in the woods can make your imagination wander. That's what I told myself, so I turned around and started walking again. But as I continued down the trail, something about the forest felt slightly different. I couldn't explain exactly why. The trees were the same, the trail was the same, but the atmosphere had changed, almost like someone else was nearby, just out of sight. I walked another 100 yards before something else happened. Up ahead, through a small gap between the trees, I noticed something pale. At first I thought it was a piece of bark reflecting sunlight, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else, something vertical, standing between two trees. I slowed my steps without even realizing it. The object didn't move. It just remained there in the distance, and the closer I got, the clearer it became. It wasn't bark, and it wasn't a fallen branch. It was a person, standing between the trees, perfectly still, about 30 yards ahead of me. For a moment, I assumed it must be another hiker, someone exploring the same trails I was. That wouldn't have been impossible. Even though the area was remote, people occasionally visited forests like that. But something about the way the person was standing felt strange. They weren't walking. They weren't leaning against a tree. They weren't looking around. They were just standing there, completely motionless, as if they had been there long before I arrived, watching the trail, watching me. From that distance, I could make out only a few details. A thin figure, long dark hair hanging down past the shoulders, and pale clothing that stood out against the darker trees. For a moment, I considered calling out, just a simple greeting, hello, or something like that. But the longer I looked at the figure, the less comfortable I felt about doing that, because she wasn't moving, not even slightly, not shifting her weight, not adjusting her posture, just standing between the trees, like a statue. And then something else occurred to me. If she had been standing there watching the trail, that meant she had probably seen me long before I noticed her. That thought made the situation feel suddenly uncomfortable. So instead of calling out, I stopped walking. We stood there like that for a few seconds, me on the trail, her between the trees, neither of us moving. Then I did something that felt strangely instinctive. I turned around, and I started walking back the way I came, not running, not even fast, just calmly heading back toward the direction of the house. But I didn't look behind me, not once. I don't know why. Something in my mind simply told me not to. And the entire walk back to my grandmother's house, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman between the trees was still standing there, watching the trail, exactly where I had seen her. When I got back to the house that afternoon, I tried to convince myself that the encounter on the trail wasn't a big deal. After all, I had technically seen another person in the forest. That wasn't impossible. There were scattered properties around the area. Even if they were far apart, someone could still be walking the trails, but something about the way she stood there stayed in my mind. It wasn't just that she was still, it was how still she was. When people stand in one place, they naturally shift their weight. They move their hands, they adjust their posture. Even without realizing it, people move constantly. But the woman between the trees hadn't moved at all, not once. That evening, I mentioned it casually to my grandmother while we were eating dinner. I didn't expect much of a reaction, but when I described what I saw, she stopped eating for a moment. Then she set her fork down slowly. "You saw someone in the forest?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, "a woman. She was just standing between some trees along the trail." My grandmother didn't speak right away. Instead, she looked toward the kitchen window. The forest outside was already beginning to darken with the setting sun. After a few seconds, she asked another question. "How far from the house?" "Maybe 15 minutes walking," I said. She nodded slightly, then she asked something else. "Did she say anything to you?" "No." "Did she move?" I shook my head. "Not really. She was just standing there." My grandmother leaned back in her chair. For a moment, she looked older than usual. Not scared exactly, but serious. Then she said something quietly. "That might be the woman people talk about." I already knew what she meant. The story she told me a few nights earlier about someone living somewhere in the forest. "The one people see sometimes?" I asked. She nodded. "Yes." I asked if she had ever seen the woman herself. My grandmother hesitated. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten slightly. "Once." That caught my attention immediately. "You saw her?" My grandmother nodded slowly. "It was a long time ago." I waited for her to explain, but for a moment she just stared toward the window again. Finally, she continued. "I saw someone standing near the edge of the trees behind the house one night." "When?" "Years ago." "What happened?" "Nothing," she said simply. "She was just standing there." That was exactly the same thing I had seen on the trail. Someone standing between the trees, not moving, not speaking, just watching. I asked what she did when she saw the woman. "I closed the curtains," my grandmother said. "Did she come closer?" "No." "Did she leave?" "I don't know." The answer made the situation feel even stranger. "You didn't check?" I asked. She shook her head. "No." Then she added something that stuck with me. "Sometimes it's better not to." Finished dinner not long after that, but the conversation left a strange feeling in the room. Later that evening, like she always did, my grandmother went around the house, closing the curtains and locking the doors. The routine felt more noticeable now that I knew why she was doing it. At the time, I still believed the woman in the forest was probably just someone living off the grid, maybe someone who preferred staying away from people. But even if that was true, there was still one question I couldn't answer. Why was she standing completely still between the trees, not walking, not exploring, not even moving, just watching the trails, watching the house? That night I went to bed earlier than usual. I remember lying in the dark, listening to the quiet sounds of the forest outside, wind brushing through branches, occasional insects near the window, normal nighttime sounds. For a while, everything felt peaceful again, but sometime after midnight, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. The room was dark. The house was quiet, but after a few seconds, I heard something outside my bedroom window, a soft rustling sound, like someone moving carefully through dry leaves. My bedroom faced the backyard, which meant the forest was only a few steps beyond the wall. I stayed completely still in bed, listening. The sound came again, slow, careful, not loud enough to be an animal running, more like someone trying not to make noise. Then the movement stopped, right outside the window. For a moment, the silence felt incredibly heavy, like whoever was outside knew exactly where I was in the room. I stared toward the window. The curtains were closed, so I couldn't see anything beyond them, but I could feel the darkness outside, only a few feet away. I considered getting up to look, but something about the situation made me hesitate, because if the woman I saw earlier that day was the same person outside the house right now, then that meant one thing. She wasn't just wandering through the forest. She knew exactly where the house was, and she had come here during the night. Eventually, after what felt like several minutes, the sound returned. Leaves shifting again, slow footsteps moving away from the window, then farther away, back toward the trees. Within a few seconds, the forest returned to silence. But I didn't sleep very well after that, because for the first time since arriving at my grandmother's house, I started wondering if the woman in the forest wasn't just watching the trails. Maybe she was watching the house too. The next morning, I almost didn't say anything. Part of me wanted to ignore what I heard outside the window the night before. It would have been easy to convince myself that it was just an animal moving through the yard, but the more I thought about it, the less it sounded like one. So during breakfast, while my grandmother was pouring coffee into 2 mugs, I told her. I described waking up in the middle of the night, the sound of someone moving slowly through the leaves, how the sound stopped right outside my bedroom window. She didn't interrupt while I spoke. She just listened quietly. When I finished, she set the coffee pot down and looked at me for a moment. Then she asked the same question she had asked a few days earlier. "Did you look outside?" I shook my head. "No." For a moment she seemed relieved, then she nodded slowly. That was probably the right decision. I leaned back in the chair. "So you think it was the same woman?" My grandmother didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked over to the kitchen window and looked out toward the trees. Morning sunlight was filtering through the forest now, making everything outside look calm and harmless again. After a moment, she said something quietly. "People around here have been seeing her for a long time." "How long?" I asked. She thought for a moment. "Maybe 20 years, maybe more." That surprised me. 20 years? She nodded. "Yes." I asked how people first started noticing her. Apparently, it began with hikers. People walking the forest trails would sometimes notice someone standing off the path between the trees. Always the same description: a thin woman, long dark hair, pale skin, standing completely still. Sometimes she was seen in the distance watching the trail. Other times she appeared near clearings or old logging roads. But the strangest part wasn't that people saw her, it was how she behaved. According to the stories, she never spoke, never approached anyone, and never reacted when people noticed her. She simply stood there, watching. Sometimes hikers would call out to her, ask if she needed help, but she never answered. And if they looked away for even a moment, sometimes she would simply be gone. No footsteps, no sound of movement, just gone. At first, most people assumed she was just someone living off the grid, maybe someone who preferred being alone in the forest. But over the years, a few other stories began appearing, stories that made people uneasy. Some homeowners living near the forest claimed they had seen someone standing near the tree line late at night, watching their houses, just standing there quietly, not moving, not approaching, just watching. And when people turned on lights or tried to step outside, the figure would slowly disappear back into the trees. I asked my grandmother if anyone had ever followed her. She shook her head. "Not that I know of." "Why not?" "Because the forest is too large," she said. Then she added something else. "And because most people don't feel comfortable doing that." That part made sense. Even during the day, the forest around her house could feel disorienting if you walked far enough. The trails twisted through miles of trees. If someone disappeared into the woods, tracking them would be nearly impossible. Still, I had another question. "Has anyone ever talked to her?" My grandmother hesitated, then she shook her head again. "Not successfully." "What do you mean?" She looked back toward the window. "There was one man who tried once." That caught my attention. "What happened?" My grandmother leaned against the counter slightly as she explained. Years earlier, a local hunter had seen the woman standing between the trees near one of the deeper trails. At first he assumed she might be lost, so he walked toward her to ask if she needed help. But as he approached, she didn't move, didn't step away, didn't speak. She simply watched him walking closer. Eventually he stopped about 10 or 15 feet away from her, close enough to see her face clearly. And according to what he later told people in town, that's when something about the situation started feeling wrong. Not because she looked threatening, but because she looked completely calm. Too calm, like she had been expecting him to approach. The hunter tried speaking to her, asked if she needed help, asked if she was lost, but she didn't answer. She just kept watching him. Eventually, the silence became so uncomfortable that the man stepped back and returned to the trail. When he looked back a few seconds later, she was gone. No sound, no movement, just gone. After that, most people stopped trying to approach her. Instead, they followed a simple rule. If you saw someone standing between the trees, leave them alone. And if you noticed someone near your house at night, stay inside. My grandmother finished explaining the stories and took a sip of her coffee. For a moment, the kitchen was quiet. I tried to process everything she had told me. The strange sightings, the silent woman in the woods, the way she appeared near houses sometimes. But there was still one question that kept bothering me. If she's been around this long, I said slowly, why hasn't anyone figured out where she lives?